is soaring in her world and in so many different ways. And so I will let Sabrina Gilchrist share about herself, and please join me in welcoming Sabrina Gilchrist as our keynote speaker today.
Good morning.
Good morning.
So, for those of you who do not know me, I feel I need to first let you know I am a preacher. And so that means a couple of things. That means, first of all, I do my best work when an audience speaks back to me. So talk back to me every now and then, right? The second thing I'll say about being a preacher is I need to make sure that everybody can hear me. Can you hear me in the back? All right.
Yes.
Wonderful. And to my wonderful videographer back there, I forgot to turn this on.
There we go. And the third thing I will say about being a preacher, very quickly, I'm going to tell this story because yesterday I sat in on Dr. Gladding's presentation, and he reminded me of how fantastic it is to share stories for the purposes of connection and for the purposes of really taking the time to reflect and to gain revelation. So here's what I want you to know. I am a preacher. I am the daughter of a preacher, and she was a daughter of the preacher, and he was the son of a preacher. So preaching's in my DNA, right? And as I was growing up, I guess my grandfather realized that it's in my DNA, it's bound to happen whether they wanted it to or not. So he sat me down and said, Nikki, that's what they called me, my childhood nickname, Nikki, when you start to preach, you need to remember that an audience is gonna be happy only one of two times. An audience is either gonna be happy to see you stand up, or they're gonna be happy to see you sit down. So he said, make sure that it's the first option and not the second one. So this morning, I am hoping, even though we are not at church, even though this is not a sermon, might get a little preachy, y'all bear with me. But regardless, I wanna make sure that you're happy to see me stand and not waiting for me to take my seat. I am so honored, so thrilled, and yet so terrified to be standing before you today to share my thoughts around what it means to stand at the intersection, what it means to consider equity, advocacy, and activism across the lifespan. And as I considered the theme of the conference and the wonderful work that AADA does, I couldn't help but think about the importance of disruptions, necessary disruptions. So I do think it's important for you to know where I'm coming from in all of this. I was born and raised in North Carolina, Fayetteville to be exact, though I am not affiliated with the military at all, have no idea what my parents were thinking. I attended Winston-Salem State University, where I studied psychology. I later went on to Wake Forest University, where I earned the dual master's degree, a Master of Divinity and a Master of Arts in Counseling. I left Winston-Salem and came to the wonderful, beautiful Queen City and started working for an organization called Right Moves for Youth, which I now have the pleasure and the honor to serve as executive director. Now, because I'm a glutton for punishment, I also work in private counseling practice with Reconciliation Counseling and Consulting. I also teach on the side every now and then for Queen's University of Charlotte, and I used to teach for Carolina Christian College. So I stay very, very busy. But I also want you to know I love public speaking. No matter how nervous I get about it, I love it. It is my passion. I am an author. I released my first book a few years ago. Thank you very much. Thank you. Appreciate that. Go check it out. Shameless plug there. And I am a huge Game of Thrones fan, except for the last couple of episodes. I thought they were awful, but overall, I absolutely love Game of Thrones, and I do believe that should we ever face an apocalypse, these are our heroes. I'm on their team, right? I've never been married. I'm 37 years old, never been married. Why is that significant? Well, it's simple, really. When I was younger, I was on the market. But now that I'm older, I'm on the prowl. I say that because somebody somewhere knows somebody somewhere who needs a good woman. Let them know to hit me up, okay? Despite never being married, I still have really loving and fulfilling relationships that went away by accident. One of which you'll see Dr. John Nance down there. I believe that relationships are necessary for our well-being. And while I never have had any children of my own, I've been a mother to many. It's been one of my crowning achievements to offer my nurturing and mothering to so many, whether through Right Moves for Youth or just in my life, in my family, in my friendships. And of all the kids that I have mothered in some facet, there is one who gets treated the absolute best, and that is my baby Zoe. That is my baby Zoe. And every morning when I leave to go to work, she follows me to the door and she looks up at me with these huge, beautiful black eyes. And I look down on her and I say, baby, I'm sorry. Mama's got to keep you in diamonds and furs. So I got to go. I got to go. But I highlight Zoe also because on top of all of these things that I am, there is one more identity that I want to highlight or share very briefly. And that is, if we were working from a medical model, I am also a person who lives with mental illness. Zoe is so special to me because I got her. She came to me shortly after I was released from the psychiatric hospital. And so she is my fur baby. She gets her hair done before I get mine done. So I honor her and love her for that. I think it's important for us to recognize that intersections exist. We do this work, we all know that. Intersections exist. And yet and still, there's so many others who don't recognize it, who don't acknowledge it, and who don't provide support and resources to make sure that people who sit at intersections can live the best possible lives they can. And so I use this as an example for my scariest moments, sort of. I'm not the best driver. If you ask people who know me, that I'm not awful, but I'm not great, okay? So something that is so nerve-wracking to me is when I find myself at an intersection that is unmanaged, an intersection that is ignored. I sit there frozen for a minute, wondering, is it safe for me to move forward? Usually that happens at the intersection of Freedom Drive and Moorhead, I'm just saying. The lights are out for whatever reason, and everybody across all of these lanes are sitting there looking at one another because, ooh, I don't want to get run over if I try to move forward through the intersection. It's the scariest thing for me, but I think I am not the only one who sometimes sits in fear or in anxiety when I find myself at the intersection. I think there are a lot of people, especially people who come from communities that are historically, culturally oppressed and marginalized. Oftentimes we sit at the intersections of our identities and have to make really hard decisions, right, about which identity can I express today in this situation. In the dream scenario, in the vision for justice, in the work that we do, people shouldn't have to decide. shouldn't have to choose which piece of who they are they express and they show. But the reality is we live in a society, in a world that is filled with injustice, filled with inequities that make us have to sit and think through, is it safe for me to progress through the intersection? I can think of a case beyond my own that makes it all the more apparent why we need to consider, acknowledge, and honor the intersections. And that would be the case of my mother. I want to share a little bit about Mama's story. Several years ago, I was standing in the den area of my childhood home with my mom, and she looked at me and she said, I quote, "Whether you realize it or not, you're walking in your mama's footsteps." She spoke that to me when I was about 15 years old. And I stood there and looked at her and thought to myself, God, I hope not. I knew that if I wanted to live to see 16, I couldn't let the words come out of my mouth, and they better not show up on my face. And so I cringed internally at her well-intentioned words, not because she was a terrible person, not at all. Quite the opposite. She was a phenomenal woman. She was a good mother. She was an outstanding educator. And she was just a fantastic clergy woman full of faith. She was a survivor, a resilient individual, a case study in overcoming significant odds. And yet, she was, for most of her life, a troubled soul. She was a troubled soul with the residue of physical and emotional abuse and trauma, cultural and generational oppressions, and yes, church and nicotine addictions. My mother suffered significant spiritual injury. She was complicated. Standing before me was a woman who never quite felt loved and who had difficulty knowing her own worth. And that's because much of her makeup, many of her identities were mishandled, mistreated, messaged as deplorable, if not downright ignored. In my book, Child Get Up, Living with Mental Illness and Faith, I wrote these words, and if you'll bear with me, I'd like to read this excerpt to you. My mother grew up in a little country town called Irwin, North Carolina, in extreme poverty and the inequality of Jim Crow. I remember stories of her entering the market through a back door labeled coloreds only and purchasing hamburger meat given to her in aluminum foil. She would walk all the way home with that aluminum package, preparing to cook dinner because she was, quote, the only girl in the house. Standing in the kitchen with the stove warming, she'd open the aluminum package to find that the meat that was given to her was spoiled and infested. I remember her telling me about the many times she would crawl down the hill to her grandmother's house, leaving a trail of blood behind her because her father had beat her so badly that she was split open. Her grandmother, being older, uneducated, and yet so resourceful, would take pork meat and lay it on the wounds because, according to the home remedy, the pork salt would draw the skin back together. I'll never forget my mom telling me about the day she integrated a high school during her senior year and being confronted by Klansmen on her way home. Sure enough, I saw a black and white photo of my mom's shaded face amongst a sea of white. And I'll pause here for a second and just add this little side note. My mother was actually number one in her graduating class, but she would never receive the recognition. Decades later, I was actually number one in my graduating high school class, but I never received recognition because people with power changed another student's grades the day before the rankings were provided. And they did this because they didn't want a little black girl graduating valedictorian of my high school. So maybe on some level, I am walking in my mama's footsteps. I wish I could tell you that after Mama earned her degree and became a teacher, she lived happily ever after. But to tell you this would be a lie. Poverty and abuse have their residue, and when we are not vigilant, the residue can get on others, especially when we don't have the resources or the support to navigate the intersections of our personhood. Mama was complicated. I guess no more complicated than the rest of us. She was a defender of people, especially those who would be considered underdogs. But she was not a defender of herself. She loved. Some days, her love poured from a bruised, battered, and scarred soul. Other days, her love barely seeped through the cracks of a broken heart that hurt to pump. She preached the gospel to the world. And yet the day she died, I wondered if she had ever found good news for herself. As a matter of fact, the one question I continued to ask on the day she died was she ever really happy? That was 14 years ago, August 6th. She was only 58 years old. A result that we often see for folks who are battling, dealing with, trying to progress through intersections. Now that I have learned a little more and I've lived a little more since then, instead of asking if she was happy, I would ask, was she ever really well? I think this face conveys with accuracy my mom's condition for the majority of her life. The first photo that I had up of her is the one that I like to think of the most. But this one is the one that makes me go, that was Mama for most of her life. Because her intersections were rarely, if ever, seen, she didn't receive enough of the right kind of resources. She seldom, if ever, had caring and courageous people to recognize and honor her multiple intersecting identities and intervene along her journey. And because of that, I can't help but wonder if she ever really had a chance at wellness, let alone happiness. And so I come back to this idea of disruption. I come back to the thought of what do we do when the society in which we live, the systems in which we have to navigate are less than equitable, when they are unjust, when we have people who are sitting at the intersection needing support, needing guidance, needing advocacy, needing activism, so we can make this world more equitable. How do we disrupt the system? How do we disrupt the status quo of systemic oppression and injustice? I'd like to propose a couple of things. The first thing we have to do is disrupt through our posture of care, compassion, and connection. I'd like to call that radical humanization. And who better to do that than the counseling profession? We are the best of the best when it comes to sharing and showing empathy and compassion. We are the best of the best when it comes to offering person-centered, unconditional, positive regard. When the world looks at the other and says the other is not good enough, the other is not equal, the other is deplorable, the other is anything less than a beautiful human soul. Counselors need to step into that space all the more, not just at the individual level, but we've got to move beyond the individual client, the individual groups or families. We've got to be more proactive when it comes to stepping on a macro level stage. Who better to show the world what it means to connect truly, authentically, from a posture of radical humanization than us? Radical humanization. It is, to me, the process by which the other ceases to be the other. It's the process by which they becomes we, and not at the expense of the beautiful nuances and cultures and experiences that make us a little bit different. No. Not at that expense, but rather in honor and celebration of those things. Why can't we hold together in both of our hands the knowing that we are humanly connected, that we are together, we are one, and celebrate in the other hand the fact that there are so many things that make us so different? Why does it have to be one or the other? I propose today that we have to be the model of what it means to hold both together, and not in tension, but to hold them together equally, right? There is a phrase that I'm sure we have seen at some point or another, and I'm not going to try to pronounce it because I don't want to butcher it, but y'all know what it is. It simply means humanity. Sometimes it is interpreted as I am because we are. I see a head nod. You can talk back to me, sister. I appreciate that. I am because we are. What would it take for us to intentionally have that mentality as we encounter other people every single day? Not just your professor, not just your relative, not just your BFF, but I'm talking about walking down the street and seeing a neighbor who's experiencing homelessness and remembering that I am because we are. I'm talking about walking into the hospitals safely when we can and recognizing the patients there, seeing them not as their illness, but as an actual human being, a brother, a sister. I am because we are. That is radical humanization. The second thing I would propose, and John, help me with my time. How many? 5 minutes. Let me run through this. The second thing that I propose today is that we have to incorporate both looking and seeing. Sabrina, what does that mean? Well, y'all know I'm a preacher, so I'm gonna take it to the word, all right? In Habakkuk, there is a familiar scripture that a lot of people will quote that talks about write the vision and make it plain. And I get so frustrated because people misquote that scripture and they use it to talk about, write your vision for buying a new car, write your vision for buying a new house. And that is not what that scripture is about, let me just tell you. Instead, Habakkuk is frustrated because he's looking at the injustice all around him. He is looking at the problems. He is looking at the poverty. He is looking at the mistreatment of the orphan and the widow. He is looking at the injustice, and he becomes frustrated. And so he says to the divine, don't you see this? What you gonna do about this? I'm tired of living in this. And according to the text, the divine speaks back and says to Habakkuk, write the vision, make it plain, so that they who run can read it. The vision that Habakkuk received was a vision of justice, a vision of what it looks like when we live in equity and radical humanization. Counselors, we have to be sure that we look at the problem, and we need to make sure we see beyond the problem to envision what equity and justice actually looks like, and then make it plain so that all of us can run. We can run with it. We've got to look and we've got to see. And it takes courage to do that. It takes courage to sit at the intersections, to look at the problems, to look at the injustices, to look at the oppressions. It takes courage to look at that and to see beyond, to see the possibilities, to see the power, to see the beauty, to see the potential at the intersection. And then disrupt the system that would uphold the status quo of power and privilege. Disrupt it through our efforts of equity, activism, and advocacy. That is the only way, not just studying about it, not just talking about it, but actually doing something in it. That is the only way that we will move the dial from the oblivion of the powerful and beyond the constructs of diversity, equity, and inclusion to actually accomplish justice. I encourage you. I say to you, we need you. I say to you, we need us to stand at the intersection and to do the hard yet courageous and worthwhile work of equity, activism, and advocacy. It's time for us to disrupt some stuff, y'all. So let's disrupt some things. It's necessary. Thank you.
I would probably get in trouble with my boss if I didn't put a plug in. Y'all check us out. Right Moves for You for Building Better Lives for Extraordinary Relationships. Since 1989, serving over 35,000 young people right here in Charlotte, Mecklenburg. So please check us out. And I have a new website that launched this morning around 1 a.m. Please check out my website, thesabrinanichole.com. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sabrina. What an honor to have you here. We hope that we see you again, and again, and again. So thank you very much. Now we are off and running to our breakout session.